linking the ancient Christian faith with modern technology. You're listening to internet-based Ancient Faith Radio.
It's time now for Stewardship Calling with your host, Bill Marianis. Bill is a stewardship evangelist whose Stewardship Calling ministry is focused on helping people, parishes, and Christian organizations discover and live their stewardship callings and embrace true stewardship and generosity so that they may have a good account before the awesome judgment seat of Christ. Here's Bill.
Human resources. What a goofy phrase. I mean, whoever came up with such a silly and dehumanizing term to describe the management and interactions with humans? I mean, doesn't it seem so depersonalized to call humans resources, as if they're to be managed like one might manage office supplies or deck chairs? We're talking about humans, the very top of the animal food chain, and the only beings that were made in the image and likeness of the creator of everything. Every activity in the world depends on humans. Those of you in the business world know it all too well, but even in the nonprofit world, and more specifically what we're going to talk about tonight, the church world, there's nothing so critical as our people. Indeed, I always try to articulate the simple why of our orthosphere churches is merely to bring people closer to Christ and each other. In other words, humans are the very targets of our churches and the doers of the work in church world, whether it's as parishioners or clergy or staff or volunteers or even guests. The church is the true home for all humans, not as resources to be managed, but as the very focus of everything we do. And never before has there been a greater need to focus on the needs of our people in our churches, as we see the steady declines in church attendance and church engagement and in service and philanthropy through the many ministries that our houses of faith may support. Nonprofit Pro published in August of 2021 an article entitled "Why Volunteers Are More Important Than Ever." This is especially after the COVID-19 pandemic shutdown, where more than 90% of volunteerism had to end instantly. And they cited a study by their independent sector and the Do Good Institute, I like that name, that tries to calculate the economic value of the average hour of a volunteer's time. Now, obviously, the actual value of a volunteer hour depends on the services that are being performed by the volunteer. So, for example, if a doctor were volunteering her healthcare expertise, well, that might have a higher economic replacement value than the hour I spend making gyro sandwiches at church food festival. But according to this study, the average value of volunteer time was about $30 an hour in 2021, and that's actually $29.95 to be exact. And that was actually a 4.9% increase from 2020. So, in other words, if you were to look at all the data, it suggests that volunteerism in the United States has an annual economic value of over $184 billion. That's billion with a B, as for nonprofit entities, including our churches. So they save millions and millions and now billions of dollars because of the generosity of the stewards that are using their God-given talents to help their churches and the charities they love to support. So if the human side of our parishes and our nonprofits has a potential $184 billion impact, maybe it's about time that someone did a program discussing this critical resource. But more importantly than putting an economic value in each of our volunteer hours is the value of allowing children of the Almighty to use their God-given gifts for His greater glory and to fulfill the calling He has given them. Our people, our volunteers, our parishioners, our employees, they're not just human resources to be managed. They're the very reason our churches and our other houses of faith exist. So if you've wondered how we could do a better job to inspire and recruit and train and engage our volunteers, our workers, our parishioners in the mission field of Christ Church, you've tuned in to the right program. Hello, brothers and sisters, and welcome to Stewardship Calling in the first Wednesday series on Ancient Faith Radio. This is Bill Marianis from stewardshipcalling.com, coming to you from the shores of beautiful Lake Lanier in Gainesville, Georgia, just north of Atlanta. I have a simple premise that you have been called by your Creator to a personal calling, a reason to your life, and a reason for your life, something you need to do with all of the gifts over which God has made you a steward. It's what I call your stewardship calling. And St. Paul makes it crystal clear over and over again in all of his ministry and all of his preaching that we all have such a calling. In his letter to the Ephesians, chapter 4, verse 1, he clearly states, I beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called. Now, till 2017, by day, I was blessed to be a partner in two great international law firms of over 1,100 lawyers each, where I served in management and as managing partner of Atlanta office and practice in the area of mergers and acquisitions and corporate law. But my why, my personal calling, is to be a stewardship calling evangelist. I'm here to help people and parishes discover and live their stewardship callings so that they may have a good account before the awesome judgment seat of Christ, as we try and follow Christ's great commandment to love one another, his great charge to serve one another, and his great commission to make disciples of all nations. Welcome to that journey. Now, this program and a lot of other helpful tools and information about effective churches and stewardship and church strategic planning and servant leadership and other related topics can be found at my always free website, stewardshipcalling.com. And you can reach me at bill@stewardshipcalling.com. And to all of our listeners tonight, whether you're listening on the Ancient Faith Radio app or the platform or on YouTube or Facebook, we would also welcome you to join us by calling in and interacting with my special guest tonight at 1-855-AF Radio. That's 1-855-237-2346. Now, during my research in my doctorate strategic leadership program, I identified some elements and characteristics of putting together effective teams of humans. And it was really fascinating to try and take a look at how long this data has existed, how long this research has existed. So, for example, in his book, Team-Based Strategic Planning, A Complete Guide to Structuring, Facilitating, and Implementing the Process, C.D. Fogg focused on 5 characteristics of effective teams of humans. And what they all had in common, the really effective groupings of human beings working together in a ministry or strategic plan, was number 1, they had considerable discussion. Number 2, they had open communication. Number 3, they had debate, and he says even conflict on key issues. And number 4, after that considerable discussion, open communication, and debate, they would make decisions by consensus where possible, talking through the various different options until they reached a consensus. And then finally, they would monitor and measure and hold themselves accountable to those behaviors. And so if you look at some best practices and how we can organize teams of humans in our churches, our ministries, our nonprofits, and everything, those would be 5 elements. But several decades earlier, there was a book written by Douglas McGregor called The Human Side of the Enterprise. And he actually had a longer list of those characteristics of how we can build effective teams of humans. And I've kind of narrowed it down to what I call the top 10 list from his book now. The first is to make sure that the task and objectives is well understood. In other words, everybody who's engaged in whatever activity or ministry you're talking about, they know what they are trying to accomplish. They know what they're supposed to do. Number 2, informal and relaxed atmosphere, not a formalistic hierarchical thing, not the kind of thing that you sometimes see in some companies, but really a relaxed, interactive way in which they work together. The third element, similar to the one in the other book I mentioned, was lots of pertinent discussion and where members actually listen to each other with good meeting behaviors. And they go one step further and talk in the 5th element of constructive disagreement. I like that phrase, constructive disagreement. And they even talked about having conflict that's frank, frequent, and then here's the key word, relatively comfortable, because obviously sometimes when we're challenging each other, it seems a little bit aggressive at some time, but we have to do it in a loving and respectful way as we work together in our churches and our ministries. A few of the other elements that Douglas McGregor talked about that really create the best involved, people that were able to discuss their feelings as well as their ideas. Again, something that's a little bit unique in in the church environment. And they also focused on making sure that nobody was dominating the entire conversation and everybody understood what was expected of them. And that they, again, in this book, they talked about reaching decisions by consensus and holding themselves accountable. So you can see that there's a common thread of research that's been going on now for well over 50 years that are all pointing to some of the incredibly common elements of how we need to organize our human activities and enterprises and exercises and work together in our ministries to be most effective. And the science makes it clear that our Creator has indeed hardwired us for this human interaction and service. So in the programs that I deliver, I always talk about the acronym that I want everybody to remember, that God doses you, D-O-S-E. And before your mind goes to wandering, it actually stands for 4 hormones and chemicals that your Creator has caused your body to produce to reinforce proper behaviors. So the D in dose stands for dopamine. And dopamine is one of those hormones that enhances pleasure and satisfaction, and it gives us motivation. The O stands for oxytocin, not Oxycontin, for those of you whose mind went in the wrong direction. Oxytocin is oftentimes referred to as the love hormone. It's the hormone that's released within your system when you feel loved and when you're in a trusting relationship and environment and circumstance. The S in dose stands for serotonin, which is kind of our mood stabilizing hormone. And it really controls well-being and happiness. And it's actually a key tool used to prevent depression. And then finally, the E in dose stands for endorphins. And these are back for 50, and look up at 50,000 feet and see what your Creator did. He hardwired your physiology and your biology to produce these hormones and chemicals naturally to reinforce the behaviors of satisfaction and motivation and love and mood stabilization and well-being and happiness and even pain avoidance. And that's really incredible. And this is the kind of thing that we should be very grateful for. One of my favorite experiments, and I can't imagine how they did this, right? But bear with me. So at a graduation ceremony, they managed to wire up the graduates to check their hormone levels in key activities that were going on. And they were looking, particularly, they were looking at dopamine, right, as one of those things that gets triggered when you have high satisfaction and motivation and pleasure. And, but they went one step further in this experiment. Not only did they wire the graduates, they actually wired the audience of parents to just be able to test this more fully. So here's what they found out. So as the kid walked across and received their diploma, not surprisingly, they got a big dopamine hit. I mean, their system started producing all of this hormone that made them feel good and satisfied and motivated that they'd accomplished this great thing. And that was what was expected. What was interesting was that the parents of the child who was receiving the diploma, who had not been the one studying in classes and who a parent in the audience just knew, and they knew him because their child may have introduced them at some point or another, when that kid received their diploma, this parent of a friend also got a dopamine hit. In other words, we are constantly being reinforced by our Creator to look at these activities that are going on around us and experience the joy, even when the joy is not a personal accomplishment or the accomplishment of someone close to us. And that's the reason why when you see the behaviors of people watching other people doing great things, you see that their motivations are going on. These are all part of the human element. This is what our Creator gave us. And this is an important exercise that I want you to be thinking about, because ultimately what we really want to do is in the ministries and the church work that we do in our services and every aspect of the way we engage our humans and our volunteers, we need to be consciously engaging them in a way so that we can facilitate the dosing of the right kind of hormones and behaviors. But it's not just a science exercise, right? Holy Scripture is replete with examples of the critical importance of how we build teams of humans working side by side and together. I mean, among my favorite passages, and you sometimes will see on church league basketball jerseys, Ecclesiastes 4 verses 9 and 10. And the entire passage reads as follows, quote, "Two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up." Another passage that stands out as human race and civilization that we all belong to. We are all one, created by the same Creator. And equally powerful is Proverbs 27:17, where we another. In other words, we can sometimes push each other, but we're doing it in a way to make ourselves better. and more productive and more effective and really making a difference. Now, regular listeners to my stewardship calling programs know that I always try to share some of the empirical data to try and set the stage for whatever the big church issues we're going to tackle. And tonight's not going to be any different. So, for example, as I was doing some research for the programming, I was fascinated by the findings from Volunteer Hub that empirically demonstrated the importance of our humans in our parishes and our ministries who serve as volunteers. So let me give you some data points. For example, they found that 1 out of 4 Americans regularly volunteer their time. I guess that makes me wonder what the other 75% are doing with the time that God has given them. Now, interestingly, people between the ages of 35 and 54 are most likely to volunteer. And that was kind of, that range was perhaps a little bit more surprising to me. Not surprising was the fact that women volunteer more than men by a full 6 percentage points. And on average, those who volunteer, those humans who are invested in giving back to their communities, their parishes, their ministries, spend about 50 hours per year donating their time. That's more than one full work week for some. And more than 71% of volunteers work with only one organization, which is fascinating to me in that context and really an opportunity for growth. Nonprofits that are all actively recruiting volunteers in the United States. So let that soak in for a second. With only 25% of people volunteering in the United States, there are 1.8 million entities trying to get their time. So the competition for our human volunteers is absolutely enormous. Now, not surprisingly, I don't think to anybody, is the fact that volunteers are almost twice as likely to donate money to whatever parish, ministry, or nonprofit with which they volunteer. So think about it from this perspective. I mean, anyone that's ever attended any of my stewardship calling programs is used to hearing me recite data about how the single most effective solution to virtually all of our church and ministry problems is engagement of our faithful. Engagement liturgically, engagement sacramentally, and critically also engagement in ministry. And this is no different than with financial contributions. The data's clear. Suppose you want someone to donate more money to your parish or your ministry or your charity. Your job is first to focus on getting them to provide you with more of their time. And the money will always or almost always follow. And as I say in my Igniting the Flame program, own the watch and you will own the wallet. Own the watch and you will own the wallet. Go and find the opportunity. But on top of the formal volunteerism in churches and other nonprofits, the data suggests that nearly 51% of Americans found a way to also help their neighbors informally. So that American volunteer spirit is very far from dead. But aside from doing much needed work for our churches and nonprofits, volunteers also help raise the visibility of our churches and nonprofits. And they can also frequently turn into advocates for our causes and ministries. Think about the times that you may have been at work or at some social setting or some activity in your community, and you're talking with your friends or your colleagues, and they're talking about the work that they were doing, and they start getting really excited when they talk about some ministry activity or church work they were doing or other nonprofit work that they were doing. And all of a sudden, in that moment, you're excited and you're getting that dopamine hit, the dose of all of those chemicals, and you're happy for your friends. But in that same very moment, there's advocacy that's happening, and you're starting to think about, hey, what a great cause, what a great ministry, and maybe there's an opportunity for me to get involved. So the volunteer is benefited every bit as much, if in some cases, if not more, than either the church or the nonprofit for which they volunteer. Let me give you another example. According to AmeriCorps report, people who volunteer over 100 hours a year. Now, if you go back to the earlier data I suggested where people are doing about 50 hours a year, that's twice the norm. But if people will donate and work and volunteer for at least 100 hours a year, they, according to the data, are some of the healthiest people in the United States. The data is clear that volunteers, if you have blood pressure, rather than stepping away from more volunteer work, I'm encouraging you to lean into it and find more meaning and purpose and maybe even better health. You can thank me later. In fact, according to research, 96% of volunteers reported that volunteerism enriched their sense of purpose in life. And that should make sense to us, that the more we have the opportunity to serve someone else and give of our gifts and our talents and our resources and abilities, whatever they may be, not only are we getting reinforced by those dosing hormones, but it just always feels good when you can help somebody else. And what they also talked about, and this was an interesting piece of data, and maybe when they're making recruiting decisions, and this was according to some research that was done by Career Builder. So we're doing what the Lord called us to do in Scripture. We're doing what the Lord reinforced us to do with our dosing hormones. We're doing those things that help other people, that make us feel better, and things of and every aspect of the opportunity to engage together as humans, working for God's greater glory and our salvation, is just really a positive thing. Now, some of the data portend real problems for volunteerism and human service in the future. I mean, aside from the increased competition for our time, and look, everybody listening feels that, the rapidly declining global demographics are going to make human resources, yeah, I use the phrase, and human capital, use that phrase, much more difficult to find and mobilize. For example, just today, I was reviewing data from a country on the verge of extinction due to demographics. And who it is will surprise you. Japan last year had twice as many deaths as births. The 1.58 million deaths were 9% higher than the previous year and swamped the boat of only 799,000 births. And Japan has one of the oldest populations that's leading global figures to predict that Japan can eventually cease to exist as a country. And Japan is far from alone. World demography expert Peter Zine, in what a book I think is a best-selling, it is a bestseller, but I think it's a must-read book for everybody. It's called The End of the World is Just the Beginning, discusses at great length the relatively imminent collapse of China. Yeah, you heard me. China, the country that now everybody is talking about and everybody's fearing. Now, why? Because they had a long time ago a very disastrous policy called the one-child policy that limited every family to only have one child. And this went in place for many, 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 many decades. So they're literally running out of 20-somethings to have children in China. And with the similarly massively aging population, they have nowhere near enough people to do the work that has to be done, let alone to volunteer to help others. If you read Zine's demographic research, it shows that the massive global population collapses in many countries, including ones that will shock you when you actually read it. And they're going to dramatically negatively impact not only our human population, our workforce dynamics, and the opportunity to have people that can devote the time necessary to serving in our ministries and our churches. Now, not surprisingly, our Lord realized all of this, and he started with 12 volunteers. And then he asked them in Luke 10:1 to go make 70 more volunteer disciples. And then those 70 were to each make an additional 70 more disciples. And now, almost 2,000 years later, the most significant movement in all of history remains dominant, largely, almost exclusively, on a practical level at least, because of the power of the volunteers that were all committed to the cause. And even Aristotle, who was born 384 years before Christ, realized the importance of the human volunteer element when he once said, "The essence of life is to serve others and do good." Look, I could go on and on with data and the impact of our human resources, but I instead would like to save the time to interview my guest tonight, who is a real human resources expert. But before I introduce Dr. Mondore, let me remind you of one of my favorite passages in the Holy Gospel. In Matthew 9, verse 37, Jesus turns around to his disciples and he declares something that at the time I don't think they fully appreciated. He said, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few." And then he finished that passage by admonishing them with this phrase, "Send out the workers." And that's what we're going to focus on tonight. In tonight's Stewardship Calling with my special guest, Dr. Scott Mondore. Now, honestly, I feared it would be like pulling teeth to get my good friend Scott to participate in this program. Not because he doesn't like to help. In fact, I think he's one of the most gracious and generous stewards with his time, his talents, and his treasures that you'll have the opportunity to meet. but he hates the limelight. In fact, he hates it so much that as he uses his God-given gifts to help so many people around it, he always wants to do it without recognition of the great servant leader that he is. Well, that's going to change tonight. Because tonight I want to call upon him to offer the great insights and wisdom that he's acquired, not only in his academic studies, but in the successful companies that he's run, in the research that he's done, to help us inspire others to be the kinds of volunteer servants that can make a difference in Christ's church. So very honored that Dr. Scott Mondore is my guest tonight. He is a entrepreneur. His expertise is in predictive analytics. I mean, I don't even know how to spell predictive analytics, let alone what it means, but he's truly a technology innovator. He's also a best-selling author and speaker with over 20 years of experience in the areas of human resources and technology analytics and strategy and talent management and measurement and organizational development. He founded, grew, and sold 2 software and services companies, we call them SaaS companies, utilizing the predictive analytics and artificial intelligence to really deliver bottom line results for their customers. The most recent of which was being SMD, which is a leader in assessments and analytics. And in